The morning had been engineered down to the minute. Ethan Cole preferred it that way. At 40, he had the posture and density of a man who trained not to impress mirrors, but to stay ahead of time itself. His suits were tailored to accommodate muscle rather than hide it. His watch cost more than most people's cars. He moved through the city as if it were an extension of his balance sheet, predictable, responsive, ultimately compliant. He told himself that control was peace. The sidewalk outside Union Square was slick from an early spring rain, the kind that didn't commit to being a storm, but left the city damp and reflective, like it was thinking about something it didn't want to say out loud. Ethan was halfway through a call with his CFO, eyes forward, mind 3 steps ahead, when his heel caught the edge of a metal utility plate. It was a small mistake, the kind that never happened to him. His body reacted faster than his mind, but not fast enough. Momentum shifted. Gravity took its due. He went down hard, one knee striking pavement, a palm scraping concrete, the phone skidding across the sidewalk before going silent. For a moment, the world narrowed to sensation, the sting in his hand, the pressure in his knee, the sharp, unwelcome awareness of being seen. "Hey, are you okay?" The voice came from above him, close enough that he could smell soap and rain and something clean that wasn't expensive. He looked up. She was young, early 20s maybe, no makeup he could see, brown hair pulled back hastily, a few strands loose and darkened by rain. She wore sneakers, jeans, a simple jacket that's seen better years. There was no recognition in her eyes, no calculation, just concern, immediate and unguarded. She crouched without hesitation, already reaching for his dropped phone before he could stop her. "Your hand, let me see your hand," she said, as if they'd known each other longer than 10 seconds. "I'm fine," answered Ethan automatically, the reflexive dismissal of a man used to being fine, because the alternative was unacceptable. She didn't argue. She simply looked at him, really looked, and then gently took his wrist anyway. Her touch was light, practical, not deferential, not impressed. "You're bleeding," she said. "Sit still for a second." People passed them, glancing, moving on. The city resumed its rhythm around this small interruption. Ethan became aware of how close she was, how little space she demanded. He felt something shift, not dramatic, not romantic in any obvious way, but destabilizing, like a floorboard that gave just enough to remind you it could break. "What were you doing, multitasking?" she asked, half smiling, as she pulled a tissue from her pocket and pressed it to his palm. He almost laughed. No one ever asked him questions like that. "Something like that," he said. She nodded, as if that answer fit into a larger understanding she didn't need explained. When she helped him stand, she did it with steady hands and no ceremony, no apology, no lingering. "You should get that cleaned properly," she said, handing back his phone. "Infections are annoying." "Thank you," he said, meaning more than the words covered. She shrugged. Anyone would have stopped. Ethan knew that wasn't true. He had spent most of his life proving it. She glanced at her watch, then back at him. "You sure you're good?" "Yes," he said, "I am." She smiled once, quick, genuine, and stepped back into the flow of the city, disappearing as easily as she had arrived. Ethan stood there longer than necessary, rain seeping into the knee of his tailored pants, his call forgotten, his schedule fractured. The certainty came quietly, uninvited, unreasonable, unacceptable. He told himself it was nothing, a moment of vulnerability mistaken for meaning, a biological response to being helped when he wasn't used to it. But as he resumed walking, he knew something had shifted, and he already knew exactly what he was going to do about it. Ethan returned to his office. Glass walls, polished floors, a view that stretched into the horizon, and a desk that had seen more million-dollar deals than most people saw in a lifetime. He moved through it with the precision of a man who had rehearsed every step, every gesture, every word. Yet something in his chest felt off, like a clock that had skipped a beat. He tried to dismiss it. It was impossible not to. The woman, her name he didn't know, her face he could barely describe beyond ordinary and real, lingered in his mind. Ordinary, real. Neither were adjectives he associated with women who intersected his life. Most people who approached him were careful, flattering, calculating, transactional. She had approached him with neither. By noon he was on a conference call, his voice calm, authoritative, ruthless when necessary. But the memory of her crouched on the wet sidewalk, hair clinging to her forehead, hand steady on his wound, undercut every practiced sentence. He realized he was listening less to the CFO, to the market trends, to the carefully constructed contingencies. His attention fractured. He didn't even know why. It was irrational, dangerous almost. Later, he found himself walking through the lobby again. He told himself it was a routine check, nothing more, but he scanned faces in the revolving doors, the elevator banks, the small cafe on the corner. No one resembled her. No one matched the sense of ease she had carried. Ethan's phone buzzed. A text from his ex. "I'll be picking up Lily at 5. Don't be late." Lily, his daughter, 10 years old, with her mother's calculating eyes and a temperament that had already left him cautious, defensive, hardened. Love with her had always been negotiated, a careful measure of boundaries, rules, and consequences. Affection was transactional, and affection was dangerous. He glanced at the clock. 5 p.m. would arrive too soon. He spent the afternoon in meetings, but his mind wandered. He visualized her gestures, the simplicity of her concern, the absence of calculation. It unnerved him more than it should have. He didn't know her, yet he felt exposed, as if some part of himself had been seen that he normally kept carefully sealed behind wealth, walls, and distance. By the time he left for home, the city was golden, the sun cutting sharp angles across the streets and sidewalks. People moved past him, oblivious to his thoughts, but he noticed everything. The slight tilt of a street musician's hat, the rhythm of children leaving school, the faint aroma of a bakery just opening for evening bread. And then he thought, maybe this is why people risked trust. Maybe there was a reason human beings allowed themselves to stumble into vulnerability. He didn't believe it, not fully, not yet. But for the first time in years, he wondered if he could. When he arrived home, Lily was waiting by the window, watching for him. The sight triggered the familiar mixture of tenderness and dread. Her small face, poised like a little strategist, reminded him why he had built walls, why he had mastered control. Love, he had learned, only delivered pain. And yet, as he watched her, he couldn't help but recall the young woman on the sidewalk, ordinary, real, uncalculating. Two worlds collided in his mind, one of certainty and defense, the other of risk and unsettling possibility. He shook his head, muttering to himself as he prepared dinner for Lily. He would not let this become a distraction. He could not. And yet, deep down, he knew the question of whether to test her, this stranger who had interrupted his controlled world, had already taken root.
Ethan couldn't shake the image of her. Not just her face or the way she had crouched to help him, but the way she carried herself. Calm, uncalculated, unafraid of being present. It was like a mirror held up to the part of him he had long locked away, the part that wanted connection, but had learned that connection always came with a price. That evening, after putting Lily to bed, he sat in his study. the city lights glinting off the glass walls. He ran through possibilities, logical, impossible, and ethically gray. He could hire someone to find her. He could trace her through the small details she had revealed, the university she had recently graduated from, the cafe she had stopped at, the shoes she wore. But that felt too calculated, too intrusive. No, he decided. The proper method was subtler. He would test her. He would create situations where her kindness might be strained, see if it held when no one else was watching. It was a methodical, controlled way to determine whether she was genuinely altruistic or if she, like everyone else, was influenced by appearances, status, or opportunity. And so, over the next few days, he began his quiet experiment. At first, it was simple. He observed her from a distance, noticing small gestures, how she smiled at the barista without expectation, how she helped a struggling stranger with groceries, how she treated people who had nothing to offer her in return. He made mental notes, cataloging evidence of her character. Each act of kindness unsettled him. It was real, unforced, and not meant to impress him, or anyone. Then he introduced the first subtle test. He approached her at the same cafe she frequented, but this time he was dressed plainly, speaking with a casual tone, keeping his identity and wealth completely hidden. He asked her for advice on something trivial, directions, a local recommendation, gauging not just her helpfulness, but her response to someone she did not know and could not benefit from. She offered help without hesitation, smiling politely, her eyes meeting his without a flicker of calculation. It was simple, unremarkable, and devastatingly disarming. Ethan left the cafe feeling a mixture of fascination and frustration. The young woman, ordinary, real, and wholly unaware of the stakes, was breaking down walls he had spent decades building. And yet he refused to allow himself to trust the feeling she provoked. Trust, he reminded himself, was the dangerous luxury he could not afford. That night, he lay awake in his penthouse, watching the city glow beneath him. He thought of Lily, of the woman's casual kindness, of his own careful control, and of the invisible tension forming between curiosity and self-preservation. For the first time in years, he felt the urge to gamble, not with money, not with deals, but with something far more fragile, trust. And that thought terrified him.
Over the following week, Ethan escalated his subtle tests. Nothing overt, nothing cruel, at least not yet. He carefully manipulated circumstances, always watching, always measuring. He created minor inconveniences, small challenges that might expose self-interest, leaving a wallet accidentally on a cafe table, asking for directions to a place he had no intention of visiting, dropping a few coins at her feet and pretending not to notice. Each scenario was carefully calibrated to see whether she would act out of pure kindness or calculation. She passed every test. More than that, she did it effortlessly. No hesitation, no hint of judgment. Her generosity seemed instinctual, a natural extension of who she was, rather than a performance. She helped the homeless man who sat on the corner outside the cafe, carried extra groceries for an elderly woman struggling with bags, and offered her umbrella without complaint to a stranger caught in the rain. Ethan observed her from a distance, sometimes blending into shadows, sometimes close enough to catch the subtlest expressions on her face. He was fascinated. He felt something he hadn't in decades. Admiration, yes, but also a raw, unsettled vulnerability. And yet, he still did not trust it. He reminded himself of his past, betrayal by those he had allowed close, love turned into manipulation, affection weaponized. That was why he had built walls. That was why he had cultivated power, wealth, and control instead of connection. Trust was a currency he could not afford to spend. But with her, the rules felt different. Even the act of observing her, of orchestrating these moral puzzles, was strangely intimate. Every genuine smile, every unprompted act of kindness felt like a challenge to his carefully constructed worldview. One evening, he followed her after her shift at a local bookstore, careful to remain inconspicuous. She stopped to help a young mother corral a wobbly toddler who had run into the street, then knelt to pick up a dropped backpack, checking its contents for damage. Every gesture reinforced what he already knew. She did not act out of expectation. She acted because it was who she was. Ethan leaned against a lamppost, heart racing with an unfamiliar tension. It was a dangerous feeling, a blend of desire, admiration, and fear. Desire he had learned to control, admiration he had learned to suppress, fear he had learned to use as a shield. And yet, here it was, unrelenting and unavoidable. He left the street that night more unsettled than ever. He had begun his tests to measure her character, but now he realized they were measuring him as well. And for the first time, he wondered if he might be the one being observed.
Ethan's nights grew restless. His sleep was shallow, punctuated by flashes of her face, the tilt of her head as she handed in a tissue, the faint laugh she gave a street performer, the ease with which she moved through the world without suspicion. He found himself replaying every detail, cataloging gestures, inflections, subtle choices. It was methodical, almost compulsive, but no amount of logic could explain the pull she had on him. The following day, he escalated his testing, but more cautiously. He orchestrated a small, morally ambiguous scenario. He posed as a disheveled, lost graduate student, messy hair, cheap hoodie, a cracked backpack, and accidentally spilled coffee in her path. Her reaction was immediate. She knelt, helped him gather his books, and insisted he take her umbrella before leaving in the drizzle. Ethan observed every second, noting not just her kindness, but her instinctive patience. There was no hesitation, no judgment, no glimpse of opportunism. He wanted to admire her. He wanted to protect her. But he also wanted to maintain control. That duality, desire versus discipline, was a war inside him. His history had taught him that vulnerability was dangerous. Every woman he had trusted had found a way to exploit it, and every heartbreak had been a lesson reinforced with cold logic. Then came the unexpected complication: Lily. The daughter he adored and feared in equal measure had inherited her mother's sharp edges. The child had a way of observing Ethan as though she were constantly calculating risk, reading intentions, and exploiting lapses in patience. Their interactions were always a careful dance of authority and negotiation, love and discipline. He had shielded her from his vulnerabilities, yet she had already learned how to pierce through his defenses. One evening, after an argument with Lily over bedtime rules, Ethan's mind drifted back to the young woman on the sidewalk. He imagined how effortlessly she treated people with respect, even strangers. Her patience, her empathy, her courage to act without expectation. It was everything Lily lacked. That night, he considered an uncomfortable truth. The young woman was a reflection of a world he had chosen to avoid. She represented risk, the possibility of trust, the possibility of love, and the possibility of losing control. For a moment, he questioned the morality of his tests. Was he genuinely trying to know her character, or was he protecting himself from something he had denied for decades? Could a man so skilled in control, so practiced in detachment, allow himself to care without calculating consequences? He did not have an answer. Instead, he sat in his study, staring at the city lights and the quiet tension in his chest. Tomorrow, he resolved, he would continue the tests. He would remain careful, measured, distant. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The first cracks in his carefully armored heart had appeared, and they had her face etched in them.
Ethan's tests began to grow more deliberate. Not cruel, not overtly manipulative, but designed to push boundaries, to reveal whether her kindness was conditional. He was careful. His mind ran scenarios like a financial model, measuring risk, reward, and exposure. But every calculation brought with it a dangerous undercurrent, his growing emotional involvement. The first deliberate test was subtle. He orchestrated a chance encounter at a small local bookstore where she worked part-time. He approached her again, this time with a seemingly urgent problem, a lost check he claimed to need cashed urgently. He spoke plainly, avoiding any hint of status, wealth, or influence. She listened attentively, asking questions only to clarify, never to judge. When he admitted he had no identification and would need help contacting someone, she offered to assist without hesitation, even volunteering to call a nearby branch herself. Ethan's heart tightened. She was consistent. She acted with integrity not because she had to, but because it was instinctive. Yet he noticed the subtle things, the small gestures others might overlook. She arranged the call quickly and efficiently, made the effort to keep him informed, and never displayed impatience. He analyzed her body language, the cadence of her speech, the sincerity in her eyes. Every observation confirmed the unsettling reality. She was genuine. That night, in his penthouse, Ethan stared out at the skyline. His control, his strategy, his cold armor, they felt suddenly fragile. He had built his life around predictability, but she was unpredictable in a way that mattered. The very thought of trusting her, even for a moment, was intoxicating and terrifying. And then came Lily. The child had spent the evening drawing sketches at the kitchen table, glancing at Ethan with an intensity that reminded him she was watching, always watching. Lily's inherited manipulative streak was evident. She seemed to read his moods with uncanny accuracy. The tension between father and daughter was constant, a quiet battlefield of emotional control. Ethan found himself comparing Lily to the young woman. Both carried strength, but one's was tempered with calculation, the other with instinctive goodness. The contrast only heightened his inner conflict. Could he allow himself to open to someone like the young woman, knowing the fragility of human trust and the unpredictability of emotional stakes? He tried to justify the tests. They were rational, necessary, and safe. Yet he could not deny that the more he observed, the more he wanted to abandon caution entirely. But caution was his armor, and he had never let it fall. That night he resolved. He would continue to test her, but he would also pay attention to himself. Every encounter was a mirror, revealing truths about him that he had long denied. For the first time, he understood that his experiment was not only about her character, it was about his own ability to trust, and perhaps to love.
The days blurred into a pattern of observation and subtle manipulation. Ethan took care not to overstep, but his methods became increasingly intricate. He created minor ethical dilemmas, leaving small, inconvenient situations for her to navigate, dropping hints of desperation, presenting choices that tested her generosity without revealing his wealth or influence. She passed each test effortlessly. Her actions were consistent, unforced, and uncompromisingly honest. And yet, Ethan noticed the nuances,
the way she hesitated for just a fraction of a second when she didn't have all the information, how she instinctively weighed consequences for others before herself. It fascinated him. He cataloged everything in his mind: smiles, body language, tone, gestures. Each observation chipped away at the wall he had built around his heart. But the more he watched, the more aware he became of something he hadn't anticipated: the emotional toll on himself. He realized that orchestrating these tests was no longer a purely rational exercise. Every interaction left him vulnerable, exposed, craving the very trust he had spent decades avoiding. One evening, he encountered her leaving the bookstore. She carried a tote bag heavier than necessary, books pressing against the fabric. Ethan stepped in, offering to help. She accepted without hesitation, smiling politely, unaware of the underlying complexity of the gesture. As they walked together, Ethan felt the pull of normal human connection, the ease, the simplicity, the rare absence of calculation. He realized he was measuring not just her character, but his own responses. Rapid heartbeat, the unexpected warmth in his chest, the tension in his jaw that he normally kept perfectly neutral. It was at that moment that he noticed the paradox of his own situation. He had designed these tests to maintain control, to measure trust, to protect himself, yet he had lost control entirely, not of her, but of himself. Every smile she offered, every small act of kindness was a revelation, a challenge, a reminder of what he had denied himself for years. Returning home, he found Lily waiting with a book in her lap, her eyes sharp and calculating. The child's gaze was always assessing, always measuring, as if she were silently judging his capacity to care. He felt a pang of guilt, both for the daughter he loved and for the self-imposed isolation that had shaped their relationship. He poured himself a drink, leaning against the kitchen counter, watching the city glow through the window. He understood something fundamental. The tests were no longer about her. They were about him, his fear, his longing, his capacity for vulnerability. For the first time in decades, he admitted a quiet truth to himself. He wanted to know what it felt like to trust, and he wanted her to be the reason he could.
Ethan's tests became riskier, not physically, but emotionally. He was no longer satisfied with minor inconveniences or casual observations. He wanted to see the limits of her integrity, to measure the strength of her kindness against subtle pressures, to understand whether her goodness could withstand ambiguity. He began creating scenarios where the stakes were moral rather than practical. He introduced small, plausible dilemmas, suggesting she could gain a small advantage if she bent a rule, framing choices that would test her patience or honesty, offering ambiguous situations where self-interest might be tempting. And she passed them, every time. Yet with each passing test, Ethan felt his own defenses weakening. He realized he was not just observing her, he was learning from her, absorbing the patience and generosity he had denied himself for decades. Her effortless empathy became a mirror reflecting his own emotional deprivation, the gaps in a life built for control and efficiency rather than connection. The tension between desire and fear grew. He wanted to step back, to reassert control, to remind himself that vulnerability had always led to pain. But he couldn't. Every time he considered retreating, he thought of the simplicity of her gestures, the way she offered help without calculation, smiled without expectation, and treated him like a human being rather than a problem or a commodity. One afternoon, he arranged a more pointed test. He presented her with an opportunity to gain a small, tangible benefit by exploiting a scenario he had carefully set up. A minor financial opportunity, insignificant in value, but symbolic in terms of honesty.
He watched closely as she deliberated, gauging not just her decision, but her body language, the subtle micro-expressions that betrayed thought, doubt, and integrity. She refused. No hesitation, no compromise. She acted with integrity not because she had to, not because she was performing, but because it was who she was. Ethan felt a rare, painful pang of admiration and self-reproach. He had designed these tests to maintain control, to protect himself. Yet here was a person proving to him, silently, effortlessly, that some truths could not be measured, controlled, or bought. That night, he lay awake, the city lights casting long reflections across the penthouse floor. He realized the danger of what he had started. His experiments were no longer harmless. They were revealing the depth of his own loneliness, the inadequacy of his defenses, and the fragile hope he had buried beneath years of cynicism. For the first time, Ethan feared the consequences, not of her failing the tests, but of her passing them so completely that he could no longer justify the walls he had built. And deep down, he knew that soon he would have to make a choice: continue testing or allow himself to be seen.